There was no escape from the road we'd adopted. A sense of pride in living the poverty-stricken life, fueled by large, flour-flavored cigarettes, surviving on oranges and avocados pilfered from the nearest backyard trees. I was writing and sketching for an hour on and off each day, and Bruce, the little dark comedian, seemed to enjoy the risk of getting caught watching the group of male unisons taking their shower from his peeping spot just outside the storm drain. Each day we kept drifting along, dazed by the sunshine and the specter of delta haze that rose from the dust and the hard line of the road. We just kept on walking into the strange purple horizon. Soon we became flower collectors and spotted them easily. There were plenty of them growing wild in a field opposite the storm drain. They were dry and mostly dead, but we'd scrambled as many as we could into bags, and believe me, when you're smoking in such fertile crescents as that, days rank as barely the blinking of an eye. After sleeping for just 3 hours on a taut wire of nervous energy, having dreamt of 2 prisoners lost, crossing bridges, I'd woken up in the morning in the bare garret of the storm drain that had become our home, with my head rested on one of the flour bags. The time on the collider read 4 a.m. Across the road was the Lindholm Research Park, which had brought about the dawn of the Genetic Liberation Act and the controversial business of mixing human and animal genes, genetically modified beings, manufactured half and quarter breeds, a new generation of designer best friends. The act received initial support from key members of Congress until it was discovered that these supportive members were major shareholders in the genetic engineering companies, the royal court of King Helios. One, Consumer Recreation Services, and a company called Bodycore UK Limited, who've paid $500 million in a bid to secure the sole rights to continue, in their words, the genetic upcycling and reintroduction of historical beings, creatures of ancient interest and pets more human than animal. The act stipulates no more than 40% animal. The people's response was to call for a ban by lobbying the royal court. CRS and Bodycore have launched a limitless range of services that include the reawakening of dead pets or loved ones, or a mixture of both. All that's required is some DNA, a strand of hair, a fingernail clipping, or a sneeze. Under a fizzing streetlight outside the park, a group of men and women raised their arms and began chanting. On the wall next to them, the spray-painted graffiti of a princely craft amongst the stars. They gathered at the same time every morning, waiting for the return of the spirits in their skyships, who they believed carried the goods that would provide for their needs. When they saw us, the fixed smile on their faces melted and they all disappeared. I'd long grown used to sleeping with a strong light in my face. Didn't seem to make any difference, except that my dreams were more coherent. Sometimes it was the happy dream of sitting in a field with my mother, with the gentle sun on our faces, not doing anything, just talking about things. And by degrees, I came to spend less time asleep. By 6 a.m., I was staring across at the park. The place had a special weirdness. All around was space, land, the illusion of freedom. But the grounds were so huge that to escape would be impossible. On one side, the fast river would drown you. On the other side, the guards on horseback would kill you. So they looked out of the view and gradually lost their minds. Research was a life sentence without parole. When the time came, the cold man would be waiting for them in a white room by a bottle of nitrogen gas, and they would be buried in the vast grounds. You would be mistaken to say that it isn't the same for them as it is for us, and that hybrids bred in captivity can imagine nothing but captivity. What I saw in their faces was not the ignorant suffering of animals. They knew well enough what they were, understood as well as we do how dreadful fate is, kneeling there under the blistering spotlights behind the razor wire walls of a cruel project, a group of explosive beasts scratching around the floor for a few stray petals to put in their burners. I drifted off to sleep, and after what felt like only moments, I woke again at the end of the curfew with a confusion of brutal bodies standing over me, FET rippers. Thankfully, their flashlights passed us by, but burnt all illusion of peace. When I looked at the collider again, it was reading 21st of June, my birthday. I remember thinking to myself, how many nights and mornings can this weird shit go on? It was a shock to turn from the wonderful, smoky beauty of a sunset over the eternal city with its lurid lights, inky shadows, and amazing hue, to realize all the grim sternness of our own cold cement storm drain with its wealth of chilled misery. I told myself that it was just another day breaking, and thinking back to where we came from, how could we be such virtuous apostles of mercy to complain about a parallel war with any spirit? For some, it could be the best day of their lives. I knew for others, it would be their last. That morning, I should have found one of the few shops that hadn't been looted and bought myself a gun, a bigger one than last time, and longer, maybe with one of those fat silencers. At first light, I watched from the storm drain as a ripper threw a grenade into probably what he thought was a flower-growing den. It bounced back from the concrete step and made a hideous clatter as it skittled across the ceramic-floored reception of the place. It was followed by a moment of silence. Then a deafening roar as it exploded into shrapnel. There were shouts, alarms, then all hell broke loose. With the pair of us shaken but still sheltered inside the drain, I lit a cigar. A fat old cigar almost as big and round as Bruce's pale brown shin. I didn't inhale the smoke. I just sucked on it, blew out the smoke, and passed it over. Bruce dropped a pinch of purple onto the end and hung the thing out of the corner of his mouth. And with all the hell going on across from us, he climbed up on a bottle crate trying to look cool, hanging an arm around the bars, trying to get a better look outside. Even with the smoke discharged into my face, I registered the 5 packs of cigars crammed into the stretched pocket of his boy-sized trousers. I stood out beside the entrance to try to get a better look at what was going on. As I was talking to Bruce with my head close into him, he went to relight the cigar, so I lifted my head away. As I did, 3 plasma flashes powered into the concrete between us, and my own cool act became a charade. Being under fire went to my head like strong wine. I don't know if it might have been the grains of dried flowers that Bruce had burned onto the end of the cigar, but I laughed wildly, but my brain was pounding. I think I managed to talk coherently, but it was an effort. When the firing stopped, I got that sickening, dropping sensation as if I was made of lead. As I was sinking down, I caught the full absurdity of a flower war. At least a dozen rippers wielding plasma guns with the bleeder resistors still humming, their heads glossy balaclavas as they waited in the long grass for flowers and bodies to be recovered. After about 30 minutes, they left. And with gunfire still going off all around us, a newsflash broke from the overhead screens. In a search for flowers and food, 2 men had entered the research park, the alternative being to travel miles out into more remote, usually more hazardous areas. As the main center for molecular biology, the park specialized in finding natural time capsules from which they sourced their preferred DNA, extracted from hominoid blood found sealed within the remains of creatures from 10 million years ago. According to the report, the donors were always perfectly preserved, all wrapped and oxygen excluded in huge slabs of amber. The company's primary income was from the nurture and study of the creatures resulting from a cross between genetically unlike individuals and the offspring of mixed unions. In the case of the creatures I saw, ape and the earliest genus of man. As far as the staff at Lindholm were concerned, they were part of a conservation project that was getting to grips with rewilding, restoring the native flora and fauna. Their first publicity stunt had been to bring back the dodo, and a local tree species which had been planted in the protected areas. Animals had been encouraged to return, breed, and live alongside the genetically synthesized creatures. Sequencing a creature much like an orangutan, as well as one very much like a Neanderthal man. Huge, bone-eating beasts. Before the park wardens could twig what was happening, it seemed that the men had set traps to catch genetically modified deer and antelope, but instead had accidentally trapped and killed a young wawat. A lurking adult wawat had been keeping the remaining man trapped up a tree. Understandable, really. They'd killed his young son, and this creature, a huge, grotesque mask of red and black fur that could club a man to death with its bare hands, had already killed one of the men. He lay still at the bottom of the tree. Now the beast wanted the other man. After a few moments of keeping perfectly still, we noticed 4 more of the ape troop arrive and begin to surround the base of the tree. The pair of us gripped the bars of the storm drain. Although this type of adult hybrid can talk and reason, the leader's reaction had been to attack the young man, who had been described as around 16 to 17 years old and a white male by the name Raphael. Now he was calling out to us, pleading for his life. We made the mistake of stepping out of the storm drain and showed ourselves. In an instant, our white faces became a magnet for the troop's attention, and I stood petrified as the leader looked towards me, gripped his muscled genitals, and expressed his jism by dipping his shoulder into a full-bore run, changing color, shifting shape, moving closer to the ground. The next moment they were all charging towards us, tearing up plants, slapping at the awkward tree roots, moving in closer, and belching to frighten away the other hybrid spectators that were gathering. The leader snorted to keep the troop in motion and order. Soon it was us that were encircled by the troop. By then I was familiar with Bruce's eyes. Now they were bloodshot and hedged in by the 2 inverted commas of his brows, his pupils raging deep and menacing. I watched 2 black abysses dilate until they finally triumphed over the gray rings around them, heralding that the madness had claimed him again. He spat out a gloopy wad of tobacco and was at once possessed with a superhuman drive to include in our experience of the morning the omnipresence of impending doom. What the hell was he doing, challenging them? Naturally, I shit myself and could only see the climactic point of my morning as a furry death lick from a 200-kilo ape with the tongue of a reptile. He tore off his shirt as he marched, and the way he'd been living, you could have pressed his body, but it wouldn't give. It was like a slab of mahogany, no give anywhere. with the smoke still bit hard between his teeth. The force was intense, alive, white-hot and cranking, our man with the little singing legs, muscled as a squirrel, spirited as a horse. Here was a man with a new trick, the ability to drive open fingers into closed steel cans of cola as he walked. He turned back to me, and with the silhouette of a panther dashing across his eyes, quoted the super warrior. "Know the over! Know yourself, and the victory will no be at risk. Know the groove, know the natural condition, and the victory will be total!" He shuffled around the meanest zone of a dark place with a heightened sense of consciousness, got himself to the center of the troop. With a cold silence growing all around him, the morning sun seemed to move him closer to his destiny. A kind of luminosity came over him. He became the killer on the road, the hitchhiker on a psychic landscape with this new and uncanny power to foul every mind with a message of endarkenment. A message that could tangle and tame wild animals in its ramblesome verses. Osalam Esia, Ora Sola. I lit another cigar and watched the 2 matches flame out. Only those who the gods love die young, I thought, so we might have a chance. The leader of the troop lay down a saxophone made from reeds and rushes and filled his chest with air. Surrounded by the creatures, Bruce became a master of effortlessness, a sushi chef with hands like cleavers that sliced the air around him. I'm human, and nothing human is foreign to me. But this new style was another place. This new style was religiosity itself. As he moved across the sands, his footprints disappeared behind him. The crickets and cicadas started throbbing, and the morning became so steamy and still that it seemed to float up against my skin. Then Bruce threw the first real kick I ever saw from him. My jaws fell open like the business end of a refuse truck. He could fly. His hands and feet whistled past my head. The experience of watching him felt like Hollywood, but this was better. There was flesh and bone in every movement. He had none of the ingenious devices of James Bond to help with the rescue, nor were there the big legs of John Wayne wading through to help his task along. This was the science of one small body taken to its highest form. The violence, no matter how outrageous, was strangely purifying. He moved with a new rhythm all of his own, and boy, was he fast. So explosively fast that the paths of his hand strikes were invisible. He threw a punch into the air, and with it a power came roiling from his belly, assimilating itself into a wave that fell over the gathering crowd. The wind blew through me. My hands shook. I quivered in shock. All at once he became so explosively fast that my mind traced and thinly sliced the tracks of his hands into a series of chops en route to a mighty bone-crunching blow, which didn't connect, just stopped dead a millimeter short of its target, the ape-man's nose. I was witnessing the beginning and end of new techniques that would be invisible to the unheightened mind. Fists flying so fast, feet soaring, punching and kicking at the wawats who came at him from all angles. Bruce's limbs were now moving in such a marvelously precise fashion, with such perfect grace and balance, that the blows seemed to slice the air in front of him into stackable cubes. And then when it was over, when he was standing still, with a fly buzzing around his head, something inside him continued to vibrate. "How did you do that?" I asked. "Mr. Lydon, those loyal to the golden finger will embrace risk and danger and play dice with death." Objects of great excitement and exotic beasts such as those should have been unworried, rested contentedly caged, secure in the belief that mankind is safely behind bars. But encircled by a gang that afternoon, I watched, heard, and felt our Bruce smack 4 wowats so hard and fast that they froze where they stood, their neurocircuitry scrambled. They bowed. They fell. They lay. And they didn't get up. Once inside the storm drain, I noticed Bruce had been bitten and was going down in energy fast. I hurriedly grasped a handful of flowers from the sack, rolled him a joint, which in a few minutes had somewhat improved him. Judging by his face, he was on a mental sojourn, watching some sort of picture show going off inside his head. After some time, he became quite hysterical, raising his open hands, beating his palms together in a perfect happy clapping. He sat down and stood up. Tears rained down his cheeks as the flowers took hold. I felt for him and opened my arms. With a deep sob, he laid his head on my shoulder and cried like a baby, shaking with emotion as he turned into a panther for the first time. All at once, I felt this big, sorrowing beast's head resting on me, so I stroked his fur. And because I was so intoxicated myself at the time, I never thought how strange it all was. And after a while, his sobbing stopped, and he got used to the idea, moving down to the ground and walking around on all fours. We straightened out quite quickly. The rippers were closing in on us, surrounding the areas round the storm drains with impossible walls. It was beginning to seem as though it was no longer our destiny to see brighter days. The king would probably reduce all of the provinces to ruins before taking them back. The growers who managed to escape would probably move out to Cotgrave Woods. Once there, they'd probably starve to death or be eaten by wild animals. More dead were thrown out into the street. Once they're collected and registered, they'd be handed over to porters, loaded onto trucks, and transported to Eturias underground cemetery. A long line of funerary sleds bearing the bodies of the deceased queued at the reception box. In some of the sleds, there were 3 and 4 bodies piled one on top of the other. One of the bodies had been a man named Fogo Wise. The oppressive heat wave finally broke. According to the collider, the previous day's temperature hadn't dropped below 90. Now it was dipping into the 70s, and with it came a blessed coolness that carried through the storm drain on a soft breeze. As the daylight crept around the concrete, a little mist drifted in from the mountains, its sneaking red tendrils extending around us. Rewarded by jammed traffic lights, we walked the road mile after mile, following the crowds that swept us further and further from the danger and the diminishing vista of the black and white wraiths rising from the war zone behind us, until I saw the sign that read, "This way to Summerland." We stopped for a few minutes beside a service station, and I watched Bruce sitting in the sand, fishing out lumps of oil from the bituminous puddles that blapped and burbled all around him, putting them into jars around his waist. From a tiny dot on the horizon, a solitary car appeared and sped up towards us. When the vehicle slowed, streaks of blue lightened the air behind, and in a moment, an expensive-looking tour car with Z-sled decals throbbed beside us. The car likely originated in the Eternal City, where such flashy cars were popular among the wealthier dealers. The roadster was thirsty for fuel, and as the morning moon slipped down through the sulphurous smoke of Ash Mountain, the vehicle pulled off the road and into the filling station. Soon the shiny car was idling beside the pumps. In a surreal whirl, the driver removed his goofy sunglasses, slicked back his grungy hair, and showed himself to everybody. A young man with colorful pants and stripy socks was sure to become the object of stares from Bruce. "Give me all the medals she'll take," he told the female attendant. As she filled the car's tank, he reeled around, making passes. His slurred witticisms were hopeless, just words that came out of the mouth of a person whose eyes told a different story. When she politely turned him down, he seemed anxious to be on his way. He'd soon paid for the fuel, and without paying any attention to us, tipped the nose of his car out towards the road, very nearly running over Bruce's foot. He saw Bruce slipping backwards into the oil, and by way of an apology, he asked us if we needed a ride. He flung open the door and continued the routine, flicking gumballs into the air, catching them in his mouth like peanuts. With the car tipping and rocking like a gondola, it required marine-grade skill to jump onto the shelf that stuck out from its flank. Once I'd mastered the naughty art of standing on one leg, we all slipped down into the leather and fastened our belts. He hit the accelerator, and the car flew at lightning speed, pinning us all to our seats. In a car that combined absolute controllability with terrifying speed, the sweet smell of flower blossom through the heater vents soon became the clammy stink of terror. Lines of date palms and crumbling marble columns flashed by, while our pilot bopped around freaky-deakin to the sweatbox disco on the radio. Our company seemed to send him into a kind of funk that he never quite recovered from for the rest of the journey, only stopping from time to time to remove his shades and glance up at his bloodshot eyes in the rear-view mirror. Each time, he saw one of life's boyful creatures, full of pride and streetwise cunning, confident enough in spirit to face his garden men, but due to an anemic soul, couldn't seem to face himself. I think it would be fair to say he was the kind of guy you'd vote most likely to kill everyone at the high school dance, a person whose mental state could probably deteriorate to such a point where he could do that, but probably opt to kill himself first. He introduced himself as Turk, passed around the gumballs, and began telling us his story. "I was floating around on a wave of self-destruction. It's what led me to try magic bullets for the first time. Since then, I set out trying to find my own magic bullet, for change. Me and my girl ended up like frightened puppies. We forgot how to play nicely. After a few months of using, she said that it was draining her and there was no feeling left." With the tip of his finger, he picked up tiny fragments of chrome shell from the carpet, deposited them on the corner of the ashtray, where they remained unmoved for the rest of the journey. While my stomach turned, he looked in the rear-view mirror, wincing at his own stupidity. "We just take logic and torture it till it screams, I guess." Bruce looked at me and rolled his eyes in despair. "I'd been out one night with some musician friends. They offered me some magic bullets. I'd always been fascinated by them, the way they trickled through the fingers. I'd never been brave enough. That night, though, I just wanted to die. I guess, screw it, let's do it. I jammed the barrel in my mouth and let one go. I threw up everywhere. But all my anxieties were gone. And then she went crazy, said she couldn't listen to my music anymore. It reminded her too much, too many memories." As stars railed across the red sky, Turk explained that in the space of a year, he'd gone from a cassette star to a primetime attraction. "Everywhere we played, man, fireworks in the sky. People screaming! He checked his eyes, turned on the radio, and changed the subject. They've taken control of the station, you know. Every system in the city's been hit. He shuffled around in his seat, took out a handful of gold coins from his back pocket, and there, in tiny lettering, the King's Promise. Even from a coin, his voice pursued you. From the currency, from the overhead speakers, on posters, on the wrappers of cigarette packets, everywhere, the all-enveloping. The red star had shifted round, and the myriad marble pillars, without the light shining on them, looked as grim as prison bars. In a flash, my heart quailed before enormous pyramids. A nuclear strike couldn't knock them down. I wondered why I was sketching a picture for someone in the future, someone in the past, for an imaginary friend, for a civilization that might never come. It was crazy flying over sand, but Turk seemed to have the flow until we hit the cameras and a traffic jam piled up in our wake. After the initial burst of excitement and the weightlessness, I soon became fatigued and slowly turned the conversation to flowers and resins and the best place to acquire them legally. A pair of genocidal X-rays stood behind ribbons of barbed wire in their glass sentry boxes, blinking at things invisible to our eyes. As we got closer to them, we shrank back below the damp canvas of the Zephyr's solar screen and watched as they waved hitchhikers onto the road that led to Summerlands and beckoned cleared shoppers into the precinct. When Turk leaned out of the sled to show his pass, the rays stepped out into the air and resolved into the stark form of two royal blue specters that shimmered like warm silk in the liquid haze. We stumbled out of the Z sled in quite a mix-up as to our locality and the exact distance to the pharmacy. By the time we found the square, the flowers were waist-high. All around us in perfect rows were pinks, yellows, and greens, and trees. I'd never seen the like, with branches that seemed to fight amongst themselves. The square was far more civilized than we'd been used to, although as we walked, hungry-looking vultures circled overhead. Amongst the clutter of neon signs, there were jewelers, map engravers, architects, daily lawyers, and the usual agents of obscure enterprise, the pawn shop, with its windows full of Dutch wives with their smiling vaginas, and the Roman dongs that, according to the box, punched harder, went deeper, and did the things that human things couldn't. The window next door, with its lines and pumps, gave my technology back home the brains of an earthworm. It was a place where a new wave of independently minded experts produced one-of-a-kind babies. The sign read, "Improve your child's mental and physical qualities for bigger brains and greater intelligence. Grow embryos outside of the body. Cultivate your own offspring from seed to schooling. Choose a spirit and soul, engineered to match your own emotional balance." Since updates to the Transplantation Act were pushed through, the place had become known as the Kidney Bazaar. And all about us in their tanks, body parts were taking shape, tumbling together in the green solution, bumping around a row of pink fleshy lungs that stretched and relaxed, pumping blood back around the plastic pipes. At the end of the row, a dim white-haired figure loitered. It was the man we were supposed to meet, the man we had heard about, Luke, the pharmacist, standing under a shop sign that read, L. Green, Pharmacist, Vapor and Lozenge Specialist, Bespoke Coil Building Service. Slumped on the floor next to him was Pandora, a friendly-looking panda, who appeared to be desperately stoned. Lucky wore his shock of white blonde dreadlocks very long and arranged like the fronds of a palm tree. If there were stars in the world of horticulture, he was definitely the brightest. As he walked towards us, I began to get the measure of him. A man of medium build with square shoulders, set about by a green flower-patterned smoking jacket with silk-flattened lapels. He bowed, gave us each a single yellow rose, and by doing so gave me the first opportunity to study his eyes. Pink eyes, luminous and insanely dilated. Sensitive eyes to which any source of bright light was too much to bear, he kept them well hidden. From the corner of a pair of thick black shades, he chatted gibberish to a panda. His face was deathly white and quite bony, with a hard, unshaven chin, thin blue lips, and a strong nose. Not completely straight, but with quick, sensitive nostrils that broadened around flowers. Although considered by many to be overtly pretentious, to me, this man with the greenest of thumbs appeared to have retained all the quizzicalities of innocence throughout his success, and it all appeared so very well balanced. A very well balanced head on solid shoulders, with every inch positively humming of pollen tincture. The entrance to the pharmacy was deception in itself, a small single-fronted affair set within the entrance of another shop. Through the green glass I saw a unison coming to greet us, a multi-limbed female called Anima, who, with a single polypidous movement, opened the door to a medicinal tea shop striped with sunlight, clotted with midsummer flowers, and alive with the sound of tropical wildlife. I began trying to process the massive wave of warmth and the wondrous wall of fresh mint and thyme blowing towards me, while the ceiling fans chopped through the muggy air and the creepers spilled across the floor like green paint. A single dissolute bumblebee buzzed vacuously through the spicy air. Anima had somehow, through evolution or genetic intervention, had her lower configuration copied onto her face. The only reason I could imagine was that it was for the purposes of titillation. It was certainly a face, although roughly the shape, texture, and size of the average pubic triangle, with adult female connotations that would usually have been more in line with a crawling infant, which is exactly how I felt. The kiss was double cheek, not as I expected, one of those performed by fashionable people, you know, the kind that bounce from side to side with little chance of a wet landing in between. No. This kiss was aimed with a much higher level of intimacy, and the message magnified by the introduction of a wet and well-muscled tongue. By then, Luke was sitting back behind the counter weighing flowers. It was a casual voice that drifted through the leaves. "Oh, don't worry about Anima. She's not flirting. It's her way of testing your immune system. She's consolidating a bond. There won't be any pheromones involved." When I tried to gently pull free, I felt a hand up my back, and she carried on. And so did Luke. "The apple sauce you can taste comes from feeding her babies. Pre-chewed food." By this time, I could feel my tonsils being violently massaged. "She particularly enjoys kissing. A superior sense of smell, you see. She's usually quite fussy about who she shares her bodily fluids with. You're honored." She seemed quite comfortable in her skin. But I was shocked again when the orifice in her face opened and she began talking through it. The shop seemed to have a climate all of its own, one of dense humidity and full of Luke's complicated inventions, some for even the simplest of tasks. There were brief interludes of burps and squeaks as the vacuum packer switched from mechanistic momentum to melodic serenity, dependent upon which type of lozenges it was packing. He paid no attention to the electric cord that was sizzling overhead. Colorful wires and pipes weaved around every corner. There were rolls of blue turf and plastic bags of biofeed everywhere. Sapphire blue halogen lamps cast granulated fountains of shadow onto the walls, and the ceiling dripped with algae and mountain spring water. It ran in through the rocks above and spurted out through a dozen plastic colanders. Everywhere I looked, deranged horticulture ran riot. On the east wall, vivid shoots burst miraculously through the debris of old ladders, while strange grasping vines clambered across the dotty lids of giant fungi. On the west wall, palms rose like watchtowers, their pennants oozing fresh green sap around their tubs. On tall metal racks, drums of chemical waste dripped, crumbling the paint on the walls, leaking their eerie spectrum of phosphor onto an indigo puddle on the floorboards. Behind the glass-banded screen, Luke sliced vegetable skins into strips by hand. Once that task was complete, he began another. Working meticulously with a bottle dropper, he dripped single beads of dark purple oil onto tiny squares of blotting paper, and soon the air around him carried the sweet aroma of mixed fruit. When he established the pharmacy, it had never been his aim to become an international celebrity. But after the first 6 months of trading, he'd built custom with his made-to-order vapor machines and sticky lozenges that soon bore the insignia of one of the country's most recognized brands. After his grand-scale success, he was returning his attention to the small and expanding custom lines. 10 years previous, this vocation was more commonly known as the goodie trade, a business where patrons could order custom medication and under-the-counter goods from a licensed proprietor. The staff would spend days on end sampling new recipes at a boardroom table equipped with spittoons. Promising new ones were then tried out on the chronics. Brass-handled drawers stood 20 feet high with hundreds of bottled medicines, each one labeled with a strange name: Euharmonics, Sweet Baby, Dark Clockwork, Benedicted Bitch, Lucky's Famous Green, and 100% Blessed. When future historians sift the archives, trying to comprehend how the man came to envelop the collective consciousness of a complete nation over the course of one brief summer, if they were to seek out the authorities' white box recorder from his shop, they would see a very long line of characters that were more or less fully dependent on the experimental movement being so brutally trampled on by the corporate giants. Anima had set aside her green-fingered tinkerings for the day. She was working on another cash crop, just as profitable as the vegetable matter. Holding a snake with a head the size of a small dog, she pressed its fangs onto the rubber lid of a specimen jar. White, milky fluid oozed down inside of the glass. The crystal vials on the counter were full of the stuff. While the snake hissed and coiled, she played the milkmaid to perfection, gripping the rattler behind the head and massaging its poison glands until the venom squirted from its fangs. Luke's other helper was Mary, a tireless worker for women's liberation who'd railed against the sale of unisons. With her black satin shroud and eyes like green jewels on 2 cushions of brown velvet, on first sight of her, as an aid to remember her name, I said 3 Hail Marys to myself. She guided us through the shop and offered us a table in the shooting gallery right under the best window, one with a good view of the pyramids. Skinning up using papers bought from Blackpool and the tobacco from a packet of Hugo's Palmer's Finest, we sat amongst lush bamboo plants, their black-ringed yellow shoots drooping lime fingers into a water-pebble feature, creating an oasis of calm, a perfect glade in the fold of a blue turf carpet. We sat unmoved by the water that dripped onto us. It dripped onto the panda's head as well. She just lay on her back, groaning, pointing into space. Luke was delighted by every new discovery. They all belonged to his destiny: the overgrown daisy, the dandelion, and the bumblebee. The way he looked at the flowers, and the visceral feeling I got when he looked so intensely at me, was to be reminded of a child in a wonderland. He was still a schoolboy when he realized that making money wasn't enough. He needed the glory. He'd been tiny, undersized, and since he'd been born almost blind in both eyes. Any coins he earned would have been easy pickings for stronger kids. So Luke, known as Lucky because of his knack with the plants, assembled a talented gang of girls to protect his cash, and there was a considerable amount to take care of. During the great drought, he would wake at 5 a.m., do 2 flower rounds, then rush back to the florist, buy up all the wilting flowers, and sell them for profit at school. When his mother had asked if he ever smoked any of the flowers himself, he replied, "No way. That's my supply. That's my profit." As he carried on weighing and bagging flowers, I shouted to him, "I love the shop. It's fantastic. What's your best seller these days?" "We are always trying to improve our range. I'm developing some new lines at the moment, single droplets of therapy. Pills full of nano flower particles with added magnetic grains that can swim through the veins, right to where they're needed. Particle delivery, that's the key. I'm developing heat-seeking particles that swim towards sick tissue, and this one, Lubo Royale." He waved his hand in front of a large blue plant, which responded by squirting a fine mist towards him. "You see," he said, lifting the price ticket, "flower particles that can delete the gene that makes you more likely to develop a certain condition. One of our best sellers." One by one, the wildlife arrived, drawn, haggard creatures. A lowly band of hybrids with the collective energy of a dying fire, and one whose gray wings matched perfectly well with the hollow burning eyes and grief-written lines of her face. Since their tortured bodies would only straighten with a sacred smoke, Luke with his holy flowers had become recruiting sergeant for their ghastly rank. One by one, the orders for mind candy were machine-gunned into him through the glass-banded screen. "Vigna urnocumenosis, Rapionus slaviatorius, Leptospermo, and sacred purple Glendora with an extra pinch of quint." Luke loved the purple Glendora. He called the end product his most holy. It seemed that the king understood that it allowed users to normalize their behavior and sanctioned Luke's program on the condition that all of the flowers used by him had been grown under license in the king's fields or on his own premises. It was Luke's chemical genius and burning ambition to process in quantity and make the holy readily available to everyone. This concession had improved his already colorful and quixotic lifestyle and irrevocably transformed his reputation. His ultimate career goal was to perfect their normalizing effect and get them into the hands of as many users as possible. He had begun by inventing a bogus company named the Polar Research Group. That way he could order massive quantities of flowers from the establishment's own fields, then set up the exotic pharmacy to process them. It was with the help of some creatures in the adjacent dome that he experimented with the dosage strength, testing his customers with free samples. He had plenty to spare. His usual stock of flowers was enough for 2 million doses. At first, he began offering the processed flowers in the form of a liquid, and since it was the same color purple, he handed out the free samples in soda pop bottles. In this form, dealers could carry the flowers openly. Each bottle contained at least 1,000 hits. Then he purchased a confectionery press and began producing lozenges, changing the color at random through each color of an indigo rainbow. Not only did he control the processed flower's appearance, but the price as well. His end product was widely acknowledged as the best. When interlopers flocked to snap up his latest batch, it was sold to them only after they had signed an oath not to charge more than a pre-agreed sum per dose. Mary would frequently walk along Odeacia Road, handing out the shop's wares for free. Stories about the free elixir had lured more social pariahs to the province. She helped spread the word with a highly publicized whistle-stop tour of poppy shops and clubs where those who usually smoked off flowers could imbibe the purple liquid, ingest the lozenges, judge the effect for themselves. Word quickly spread, and attracted by rumors of the minimum time one had to spend waiting for a prescription, Luke's exotic pharmacy had become a happy oasis for all of the worst cases. With the gladness in their hearts showing clear on their faces, there followed a long silence in the shop as the morning's troubles were smoked away with lung-crippling draughts of exotic oils. Starry-eyed misfits, their faces twisted tubes of flesh that would melt back to some kind of normality, as they gradually found the connection that makes us all acceptable to the gods, and vice versa. First to arrive was a lizard-like figure with olive-green skin and a jacket that bore the purple ostraca of the king's new order. He burst into the pharmacy, walking with quick, short steps. One of his gripping limbs curled open amid the boxes. Another limb appeared, feeling its way over the cosmetics basket. I stood petrified, staring. While there were no teeth in his lower jaw, he had the longest pair of arched fangs protruding from under his top lip, so that his sickly smile, which chiefly involved tilting his head back, gave him a gaping mouth. If you add to that portrait his manner of walking like a mincing choreographer, his ability to hug the walls and slide through doorways, his odor of undergrowth, and every appearance of anorexia, I'm sure most would agree he could not be imagined anywhere else except behind glass, earnestly clutching a pile of greasy eggs. I watched him through the shelves, the head, or the face as you might call it, and the large dark eyes of a snake, peering back at me, wet black spheres that had full control of my mind, and a long powder blue tentacle that came feeling for me through the rolls of cotton wool. In a moment he'd slipped off towards the counter, twisting and turning with queer, jerky movements. For a while I stood fascinated by his speedy gathering up of product and his long slide into the counter. Mary greeted everyone with the same indifference. "Good morning, Sean," she said, casually snapping on a pair of rubber gloves. The angular jaws split open into the sickly smile, and Sean hissed out his situation in short sentences. "Mary, I'm in a bad rattle. Totally beaten this time. Probably about to make some lunatic mistake. My usual sorter. Please." Mary, trained to spot drug-seeking behavior, stood as malevolently impassive as a stuffed parrot. For a few moments there was no sound at all, just the anxious thrumming of Sean's tail on the floorboards. While waiting, He began slipping down towards the floor until his fat head was rested on his clenched fist and his knuckles pressed into his green cheeks and squashed his lips into a tired and thirsty look. Under a wide reptilian brow, slitty green eyes looked calmly over Mary's lozenge selection. Behind the toady mask, blood was throbbing cold through the wormholes of his brain. A thick snake-like vein in his forehead pulsed at a beat well over 200. It was plain to see that the specter of scoring had both hands around his throat. He'd probably sweated away half a kilo of body fluid waiting for the shop to open. Luke countersigned his prescription. Mary handed over his usual packet of lozenges, and his eyes came alive again. A forked tongue flicked around the orange cellophane. A thumb and forefinger opened up like the pincer of a crab. He slowly brought the box up to a bulging eye and scrutinized the recommended dosage before tilting the box from side to side to listen to the warming patter of the foil trays inside. After satisfying himself that they were the correct strength, he handed over the money and began bending and curling his way back through the whispering gossip to the road, where he slipped on a pair of shades to watch the sky erupting.